Hi there. I bet you're here for the story, aren't you? Hold up a sec, let me get Josh.
Oh! What? Where am I? How did I get here?
Josh?
I was in my room!
Josh!
Josh! Where am I? I want my...
Alright, so Josh is here to tell you fine people a story. But something still feels off.
Nothing
I know.
No.
And here we are in the story room. Cozy.
It's very cozy in here. Yes.
Oh, look at that.
No.
Bro, we got some cocoa.
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 Ah.
Oh. Tally ho.
Delectable.
My good sir.
Do you like my sweater?
Oh, I love your sweater. How do you feel about mine?
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. Anyway, Josh, how about you pull us one of these stories from our shelf?
I've got a lovely story today, Peter.
Oh, I'm excited.
Oh yes, let me grab it for you. I keep it here on my bookshelf. It's actually a new story today.
Oh.
One you've never heard before.
Oh.
Oh yes. It's
surprising.
It's written by some brilliant authors. Yes. It's very new. Written recently.
Oh.
This week actually. Well, last week, yes.
And it's already published?
It's already published. It's already made $1 million.
Wow, that is, wow.
Yes.
That's a lot of money.
It has the very original title of Story.
Oh.
Yes, very good.
Well then, let's not waste any more time.
Would you like to go back and forth reading this?
Absolutely.
Oh yes. So let's have you start with it.
All right.
Okay, and let's just get going.
All right. There once was a plant named Fern.
But this story is not about him.
Instead, this is a story of an average man named George Sedler living a not-so-average life.
If you want to know about Fern, you can ask us about him later.
For now, though, let's focus on good old George and his complete and total, all-encompassing averageness. George lived in an average house in an average neighborhood. He was of average height and had an average build. His salary was average. His attractiveness was average. Yes, everything about him was quite average.
But good old George did not live an average life. Whereas George was an extremely average man with no actual talent, his family was far from average. His older brother Jasper was the ambassador to the recently discovered nation of Rahiti. His twin sister Celeste just won the Miss America pageant and also had her third child 10 days after winning the pageant. His dad, Theodore, was the President of the United States of America. His mom was a top CIA agent and war hero from World War III. And we don't talk about his younger sister, Scarlett.
But George was fine with his life. He didn't have or need all the action and excitement that the rest of his family seemed to crave, and he didn't care that he was completely overshadowed by even the most boring members of his family. He had his house and his TV. George was content with his averageness and more than happy to keep living every day just like the last. Little did George know, however, that his life was about to take a dramatic change.
One day, George was at home. He had just finished his Big Mac and was now sitting in his recliner and watching the news. The news anchor was talking about some election or scandal or something, when all of a sudden, the lady on the TV started talking to George. Flabbergasting!
Whoa. She used George's nickname his dad had given him when he was a little kid. Little G, she said into the camera. I have a message from the president. If you're watching this, you have been ordered to meet the president at location 7 for an emergency meeting. Come alone. With that, the broadcast ended, and George sat back trying to decide what his dad could possibly want. It must have been important for him not to use his real name.
But George didn't really feel like going. So instead, he changed the channel and watched an episode of Family Feud.
I do like that show.
It's a great show.
It's a fantastic show. It was a good episode, filled with funny answers. Man, some people don't do well under pressure, do they? George thought to himself as someone gave yet another wrong answer. Now that I think about it, I don't really do well under pressure either. This realization startled George. He knew he was pretty average, but he'd never really thought about how average he really was.
Emotion took over George. He began to be afraid that his life was being wasted and that he was a worthless speck to society.
Another feeling.
George started to weep uncontrollably in his living room. He curled up in a ball on his floor and just continued to release all of his emotion. Emotion over his ideas of inadequacy to himself, his society, and his family. George didn't know who he was. Eventually, George became so exhausted that he passed out from exhaustion. He woke up a little bit later and realized he was no longer in his living room. Instead, he was surrounded by big men wearing suits and talking into earpieces.
Oh my goodness. Oh, holy heck! George thought. My dad kidnapped me. Suddenly, a deep, soothing voice sounded behind him. George, my boy, it's time. Time for what? George asked as he turned to face his father. Time to tame the mane. George's dad answered, walking toward him and placing his hand on his shoulder. It's time to be the man our family needs.
Then, all of a sudden, his dad turned into a walrus.
Oh my God.
The room turned into strawberry jello, and his feet turned into mashed potatoes. Figuratively speaking, of course.
George felt overwhelmed, and before he could do anything, he found the floor racing toward his face as he began to lose consciousness. George awoke to find himself back in his living room, but something felt different. What will happen?
As he began to remember that he didn't have a living room. Because George didn't have a house.
What?
He began to remember that he didn't have a family either.
No!
Or a job.
Oh my gosh.
George began to struggle,
Oh no.
but the restraints of his straitjacket held him down like usual.
Looks like someone's awake, said a familiar voice. You were out for quite a while. It was George's nurse, Sylvia, here to give him his daily medicine once again.
Guess George ain't normal after all. The end. Can I do it this time?
Sure.